Welcome to Coffee, Coaching, and Callings, a live podcast created for coaches, leaders, and helping professionals that are on a mission to lead a successful and heart-centered life. Your hosts today are myself, Laurel Elders, and Michael Tucker of the Institute for Integrative Intelligence, where it's our mission to elevate human potential through the art and science of masterful coaching. Today's podcast will be focusing on following your calling, answering a spiritual calling through business. We have with us today, we're so blessed to have with us, Mark Silver, the founder of Heart of Business. Since 1999, Mark has worked with heart-centered entrepreneurs to help them realize that every act of business can also be an act of love. Mark is one of the pioneers in integrating real spirituality with the nitty-gritty of small business. He founded Heart of Business in 2001. Mark is a fourth-generation entrepreneur. Prior to Heart of Business, Mark ran a distribution business, turned around a struggling nonprofit magazine, and worked as a paramedic in Oakland, California. He's a designated master teacher within his Sufi lineage and has a Master of Divinity. Mark, welcome to our show. Thank you
I'm
for
delighted
being
to
here.
be here. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you all.
Well, and I have to just kick us off by saying you are a very big reason why I'm here. When I first heard the wisdom that you can run a business and not lose your heart, that was a game changer. And I think I joined your newsletter in, I think it was around 2005.
Way at the beginning.
Way at the beginning, yes. Yeah, so empowering. So I just have to say thank you. And it's such an honor to be talking with you today.
Yeah, I'm so delighted. And I'm equally inspired by the work that you've been doing, Laurel. I mean, obviously we've been in touch over the years, and it's just you're doing beautiful, beautiful work. And I'm really grateful that you're in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. So could you share with us?
And I'm not saying anything about Michael because I only just met him. I'm sure
Yeah.
you're doing wonderful things. So
That's okay. We'll have plenty of time.
excellent.
Yeah. Well, I think what I love is that one thing I think that connects us all is we're all here to do, leave a positive impact in the world with the work we're doing and the business that we're doing. So perfect topic to explore today. And Mark, I'm just curious if you could share with our listeners what brought you into the work you're doing now.
Anger and burnout. So, I was an activist and in the punk scene way back in the 1980s in high school. And I've just been aware of injustice for a long time in that way. And it's always hurt my heart. And it got exhausting kind of running on anger. And at the same time, so many people I knew, kind of just personal friends and community, were doing such amazing work, trying to do amazing work in the world, but there's no jobs like that. So they were forced to be self-employed, people doing organic gardening or doing various kinds of spiritual work or different types of healing. And I had learned a lot more about business than I thought I had. And I started helping them. And then what happened was I realized that people were running into like really deep emotional and spiritual stuff around trying to make their business work. And that's when I began to connect with Sufi healing and started to learn from a sheikh Sidi Muhammad, who passed in 2015, but was a world spiritual leader with students all over the world. And I was lucky enough to study with him and some of the teachers under him. And so the nitty-gritty of business and all of these like deep lineage-based, centuries-old Sufi traditional healing work integrated in my heart, and other people seem to like it too. So, we were off and running.
Yeah, I love the combination of you don't have to leave spirituality at the door. you bring it with you into the work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes some effort to leave it at the door, you know, like it's you know, love is in everything. There's nothing where you can't find love. Sometimes it gets distorted, sometimes it gets covered over, but it's really everywhere. And so it's less about bringing spirituality into business or bringing love into business, and it's more about discovering how it's already there and discarding some of the things that have been taken on by capitalism,
Yeah.
and by white supremacy and by patriarchy over the last centuries, to cover that over, to disconnect us from one another and from, you know, a kind of collective care where we really can care for each other.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Mark. You know, when Laurel introduced you, she said that you were a fourth generation entrepreneur. And I'm super curious about how that impacts your experience with business.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so interesting because I was having, like, years and years and years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine from high school, who didn't have that. Like, you know, his family was more public service and, you know, jobs and things like that. And um, I just remember being like driving, and we were middle of nowhere and saw like a motel out there. And the conversation that came up for both of us is like, he was wondering what it would be like to work in a place like that, and I was wondering what it would be like to run a place like that. And so it's like this mindset of like, is it okay to kind of really entrepreneur, like take between your hands, like really be engaged at that level of running something in the United States. At the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, for those who were privileged enough, I mean, mostly white people, but of that population, fully half were self-employed, mostly on small farms. And if you go back in history, people just in general always kind of cared for themselves. It looks very different when it's not in capitalism, right? In terms of caring for ourselves and caring for our livelihood and being in relationship with other people who are also doing the same thing. But it's a very natural thing. And I think being raised by entrepreneurs, my parents ran a business that my grandfather had started, and that before that he got trained as a pharmacist and sold alcohol by prescription during Prohibition, and then started a wine store after Prohibition ended. But going back a previous generation to the old country, to Eastern Europe, there was you know, and I have very little connection. We're Jewish. We raised Jewish, and there's just parts of my history that aren't accessible. But you know, there was also entrepreneurial business there too, you know, in the generation previous. And it's inspiring, and it's just, I guess it's always really informed how I viewed the world, like what's possible. And it always seemed like a normal thing to me, like, oh yeah, you start a business, you run a business.
Yeah. So this was something that was ingrained in you, and you created this organization to help business leaders lead from their heart. Would you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So we work primarily with very small businesses, what are called micro businesses. People might be self-employed, or there might be a handful of people involved in the business. You know, a small team. We don't really work with large companies. And what happens is that in these smaller companies, people wear a lot of hats. You know, you don't have departments. You don't have like the marketing department or HR. You know, it's like everyone's kind of intimately connected with everything that's going on. And there's a lot of emotional content. There's a lot of spiritual content. People get really hung up because there are so many terrible versions of how business is done. It's all around us. And that's mostly what people have imbibed. Like if you weren't raised or you didn't spend time inside a healthy business that was run with integrity, it's really easy to only take in examples of like terrible businesses, terrible companies, terrible business practices. And even people who have really good intentions, the cultures of those companies often undermine the desire to do good. So the work that we do is a combination of awareness of um, social justice, systemic injustice needs, practical business when done from a caring, ethical place, and spiritual healing to help us come into an awareness of love, an ability of our beings to be immersed in love and to carry love in our hearts in as many situations and as many contexts and relationships as possible.
Challenge question. Do you think it's possible to bring the idea of spiritual callings into corporate America?
This is a really interesting question. One of the reasons why it's so possible to do it in these micro businesses is because of the immense amount of plasticity, like the amount of change and the amount of control that's happened. I think that it's possible. I think that it's extremely unlikely. I think that there's a fundamental issue with scale. I think that when you get beyond a certain scale, and I don't think there's hard and fast rules or lines that are drawn, like in this context of capitalism, it's impossible to operate outside that. Like if you have a payroll of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 employees, and I have yet to see an example of a company that is like fully operating on love, really rejecting the really toxic aspects of capitalism, which is nearly everything about it, and running something that is really providing good in the world. And I think that individuals can do a tremendous amount in their context, and I think that smaller companies have a much better chance, but I think that global corporations cannot. I think that the nature of the organization and the relationship that it has to the larger economy makes it, somebody said, I remember having this conversation on social media with someone that if you were, how does one of these billionaires, Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, how do they act? Like what needs to happen for them to act from their heart and to really do good in the world? And the answer that came back said that if you had access to that, you wouldn't be a billionaire in the first place. The first time in running a company that you have an employee who needs maternity leave or needs extended sick leave or has some needs that are in conflict with a level of profitability in the company, you're going to choose caring for that person. And it's going to be, and you're not going to have the resources to grow and scale at that level, because scaling at that level requires a certain level of exploitation. And I won't say like anybody functioning in capitalism has oh my God, I'm sitting here surrounded by electricity. We drive cars with gasoline, you know, we eat chocolate. All of these things have incredibly problematic issues. You know, we live on some acreage, you know, land that's been stolen from the original inhabitants of this continent. Like, I don't know how to contend with all of the different ways. You know, like as I've said to many clients, like, you cannot undo systemic injustice based on your personal actions. Like, you can't carry that burden. It has to be done collectively. But you have a better chance of being more in alignment with ethical, moral, spiritual, heart-centered considerations when you're at a smaller scale, because the relationships just remain human, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell there's a lot of passion and intensity about this topic when you talk about it, Mark. What in the world got you interested in this type of work addressing social injustice and a number of the other topics related to that you shared?
Yeah. There's so much pain in the world. There's been so many terrible things that have been done almost entirely in the name of profit. You know, I was raised Jewish, and there's a large history there. There's I came out as queer in the 1980s, as bisexual, and I was intimately involved with queer activism, and I've been queer bashed and watching like living through the AIDS crisis, and like all of these things. There's just been so much. And then, like, in the last decade and a half, to deep dive into like anti-racist work and learning about white supremacy in ways that I'd never learned when I was younger, and seeing the details of that. And and I mean, it surrounds us. The pain and the unnecessary pain and suffering surrounds us. And if I'm not going to become a bitter, destroyed person, that incapable of accessing joy, I needed to engage deeply with the source of love, with the divine, with a spiritual connection that enabled me to move in the world not powered by cynicism and anger, but powered by love and care and hope, in a way that allows me to see all the good that's being done and to help amplify that, as well as being able to witness the terribleness at the same time. And business in particular, because I was raised in it and I'm familiar with it, healing in business is not the only thing that's going to help us create a beautiful culture. But I'm hearing screams outside, kids and dogs barking. But it's a big piece of what's needed. And if I can contribute in some small or significant way to the healing in business, I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know myself and so many other people that I've talked to just feel like it's too big. It's too, the problems are too big to solve. But yet, my philosophy is that the calling is the solution, because collectively we're called to different patches of grass in life. Right. So if you cover that patch of grass, I've got this one. And before you know it, we've got a tapestry of people leaving positive impact.
Right.
And I think that's the power of integrating spiritual perspectives into these small businesses and helping them thrive like you do.
Thank you.
Survive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Mark, I would love to hear some success stories about some of the clients that you've had. Where did they start? Where do they end up?
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot. So I'll pick out one story, which is that we had a client who was an acupuncturist living in a major metropolitan area who wasn't really, loved their work, but wasn't making nearly enough money, and was beginning to get burnt out, and was thinking that they hated acupuncture, because of the burnout. And it did take 2 or 3 years, in our model of business development. This world expects everything to happen like that, but really, when you're developing a business, I've seen it take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to kind of walk through putting everything in place and iterating it and allowing your heart to heal. And it takes time, which is not a very long time unless you're expecting, unless you're living at internet pace. But over time, she put one element after another, and gradually the business started to do better. Went from like the low, 5 figures to like more the mid 5 figures to the high 5 figures, and eventually getting to 6 figures and being able to afford professional development and being able to afford vacations and being able to spend time with their partner. And but it came from putting the elements in place, and putting the elements in place, not just mechanically, but with love, right? You identify something, it's like, oh, the business needs this. Let's start to put it in place. How do I do this with love? Can I help you, Rocky? 180-pound shepherd Malamute husky. And you're very loud, buddy. You're very loud. Hey, sweetheart. Yeah, I don't know what you're barking at, but you can't do that. Come on out. There you go. Yes, thank you. So she began to just see the business do better and better and better. And this combination of healing and practical is where I see that happen. Like I've had so many people come to me saying, I have a real problem with receiving as a spiritual issue. I've done so much healing around receiving, but it's not, how can you help me? And when I take a look at their business, there's all these practical pieces that aren't in place. Mm-hmm. And I say, like, if you can learn some of the practical pieces, what it does is the business starts to be able to function. And then they realize that, sure, they may have some issues around receiving, but it's not all that. It's like, okay, wow, if I learn about how to have an ethical sales conversation, if I learn how to do marketing from the heart with a real sense of caring without trying to manipulate or take from people, if I understand how systems work and the business is crafted with love, developed with love, then sure, there's some healing to do around receiving, but it's not such the big issue that was blocking them from everything that they thought. One of the issues with capitalism is this individuality, right? It says that everything is your fault, and if it's not working, and that you have to handle it, and you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which was actually a phrase that was originally coined to express something that was impossible because you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And so this myth in capitalism in our modern culture that you can do that, like we need each other. Collective care is really at the heart of healing. Healing is, yes, partly an individual journey, and it's partly a collective journey. So if I have, we have somebody who went through that themselves, who they just did one piece out of the whole puzzle and just learned about the sales conversation. And then they suddenly saw, gosh, I can see where I was stumbling. I could see where I was so scared and shut down. I was talking a lot about my modality. And instead, just shifting to a client-centered focus, being in a place of service and love and care, which the spiritual grounding really helps with that. When you need to make money, it's hard to access that. And spiritually is the only way I know how to, when you need money in the bank account. And and then suddenly they're having successful sales conversations and they're getting clients, and it's all starting to make sense. So we're not trying to help people become millionaires, although some people do really well financially.
Mhm.
We're wanting people to understand how businesses work both practically and at a heart level, so that they don't have to be someone else, that they can be themselves, that they can come from love, that they can be ethical, and their business can still work.
Mhm. Yeah. And I just want to share that when I was first starting out, and I think, yeah, around the 2005 time frame, I was at the point where I found your services, Mark, and I was like, oh gosh, when you're first starting out, you can't really afford help sometimes. But I got on your newsletter, and the wisdom you shared just in the newsletter got my footing enough to where I could then join a class and then learn a little bit more and take make step-by-step progress. So if anybody's out there that is just starting out and really feeling a spiritual calling in your business, I highly recommend get on Mark's newsletter right away.
Thank you. I just got an email from someone saying just that. I was so overjoyed. They said, I've been following your newsletter for a few years, and it's been so helpful in setting up, my practice and making it work. Um, and I was just delighted to read that. And it's I really trust that people are, that we're going to be cared for, and it's just wonderful to see people blooming from that. And I also want to have that be kind of an encouragement for anyone else who thinks that, oh, I shouldn't do a newsletter, or there's too many newsletters out there, or there's too much content out there. There's not. There's a lot of irrelevant content. There's a lot of content that, isn't useful for you, but for your audience, they want to hear from you. They want to hear from your heart. We want to be having more conversations in smaller groups rather than just everybody listening to one person broadcasting to millions.
Yeah. And you've got a book coming up.
I do.
October. I'm so excited, called
Me too.
Heart-Centered Business. Would you like to share a little bit about?
I do. I have the advanced reader copy sitting here on my desk. So it's
love it.
Healing from Toxic Business Culture so your small business can thrive. And yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it is really that same combination of understanding, having a developmental model of business, having an understanding of how healing functions in the context of business, and how love can be present. And it's very practical and very spiritual at the same time, which is, of course, what we do. And it's really a roadmap on how to develop a business without overwhelming yourself, without hurting yourself or anyone else.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'm excited. Keep us posted. And yeah, Michael, did you have?
I did have a question. Just going, you talked about healing, and that's a word that is very near and dear to my heart for a lot of different reasons. And you were talking a little earlier about corporations, and I do a fair amount of work with corporations. And so, and I'll say it like this: I do a lot of work with individuals that are working in corporations, because at the end of the day, it's still about the individual. But what I'm super curious about is one of the points you made, or one of the examples that you gave about healing had to do with, with this particular acupuncturist, and receiving. And I'm curious about what other kinds of wounds, if you will, are you seeing with business owners And maybe you could even bring a social justice kind of a perspective to your answer here.
Yeah. So much, so a lot of the folks who come to us are women, and they have so many. I mean, what is there a woman who hasn't been deeply impacted by sexism? And one of the things that I like to help with is just helping helping to name when I see sexism, like when they're encountering sexism. Um, and it's not like they can't do that for themselves. I mean, they're women, they know it better than I do, right? And at the same time, because of the culture that we're in, people get gaslit. No, so much like, oh, that's not sexism. Oh, that's not racism. Oh, that's not really happening. And for me to say like, oh, that encounter that you had with that person, that sounds to me like straight up sexism. And again, by understanding these kinds of dynamics, it helps us to identify what really needs healing. So for instance, in a situation like that, they might need healing around being visible, about being willing to be visible. And when we acknowledge sexism and how much violence is directed towards women, acknowledging the reality of that means that we're not saying, oh, you just have to heal and get over your fear of violence. It's like, oh, there are practical things that you might need to do to care for yourself physically in having a business. And then the healing has to do with caring for your heart in that environment. Enabling yourself to access your gifts and your strength while knowing that it's perfectly legitimate to create some safety, like, don't put your address on your website. I was talking with one of our clients who has, this has happened quite a bit, is no contact with their family. And they're like, I want to be visible to potential clients, but I don't want my family to find me. So what are strategies that both help your heart to feel safer and to like access the safety within and to access the divine sense of safety and love and strength? But what are the practical pieces of how you construct a business so that you're not unnecessarily making yourself vulnerable? And it's just so important that we take collective responsibility for some of these dynamics and not just say, oh, this is a personal healing issue. So many people have, like, so many of the people we work with, and it's pretty widespread in our culture, have, yes, Rocky. He never comes up here because it's hot on the third floor, but for some reason, his voice is needed in this podcast. Hey, Rocky, come on, go see what's going on, because our other dog's downstairs barking. And I want to say that this is a part of healing also. Like the interruptions, like whether it's dogs or kids or health, so many of our clients are, have chronic illnesses. So many people in this culture have chronic illnesses. So many people are suffering from the results of trauma. If we don't create business, craft business with space for the reality of the life that we're living, we end up with these extremely unrealistic situations. We're held up these pictures of like, oh, these perfect people running these perfect businesses and making millions of dollars, not realizing that a lot of those folks have inherited wealth, or they got their start because their spouse has a six-figure job, or they were raised in privileged circumstances and somehow didn't like manage to escape having trauma or chronic illness in their past. And so we want to care for these things And yes, there is internal healing to be done. There is trauma healing to be done. There is family healing to be done. There is spiritual healing to be done. But it's not all an internal job. You know, we like to garden. And so, the tomatoes need tomato cages and stakes. They need really good soil. And we also pray and talk to the plants and bring our heart and our love to them. And, anyone who makes food tells you that love is the most important ingredient. And it's important how much love you put into something that you're cooking. But you also need the ingredients and you need things at the right temperature so you're not burning it. This holistic life that we're in, this world that we're living in, like, one of the pieces that I like to work with people on is not privileging the physical over the spiritual and not privileging the spiritual over the physical, and knowing that it's all oneness, like it all needs care and it all deserves attention. In Sufism, there's a teaching that says that your body has certain claims upon you, that, we need to care for our physical bodies. It's not just about the heart, right? Or rather, it's about the heart and how everything relates to the heart. So I don't know if that gave enough examples, Michael, but that's kind of what comes up for me in your question.
Yeah, thank you. It was very, very generous answer there, Mark. Thank you.
Did I go on for too long? Is that
No?
Okay.
And what comes to me in my mind is like, oh, you mean everything is integrated?
Yeah, right.
But are we aware of it? Are we aware of interconnectivity that already exists? Wow. Well, Mark, thank you so much. This has been just a pure joy to be in conversation with you about this. And you can learn more about Heart of Business at heartofbusiness.com. And you can also sign up for Mark's newsletter there and be on the lookout for his book coming out in October, Heart-Centered Business. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that these messages have been a lantern to your path as you expand your success as a coach, leader, or helping professional. You can join the conversation further at integrativeintelligence.global.